It is a dark winter night. A storm rages outside. You shiver while trying to sleep under a thin woolen blanket between stone walls. The fire has gone out. Morning is a long way off. How did people survive the coldest winters in medieval England? Tonight, we will tell a story that is not just a history lesson, but a struggle for survival. We will step by step explore the methods used to fight freezing temperatures, the class differences, and how people slept during those dark nights. You might fall asleep, and that's okay. But have you ever wondered why people in the past preferred to sleep in the same bed as a whole family? Don't forget to mention the city you are watching from in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Today, we will discover how people slept during the coldest winters in medieval England. First, we will examine house structures and heating methods. Then, their beds and sleep patterns. Following that, the differences between classes. Later, we will learn methods for preserving body heat. Finally, we will talk about the dangers faced at night and the precautions taken against them. But where did they start? To protect themselves from the cold, people first needed shelter. In the Middle Ages, shelter was the fundamental condition for survival. Medieval England was one of the most challenging periods in history, spanning more than 1,000 years from the 5th to the 15th century. During this long era, the people living in England saw countless wars, epidemics, and famines. But despite all these hardships, perhaps their greatest enemy was seasonal difficulty. Winter, in particular, was the hardest time to survive. The cold was not just uncomfortable, it was a deadly threat. In the mid-14th century, a period known as the Little Ice Age began in Europe, lasting until the 19th century. During the Little Ice Age, winter temperatures were extraordinarily low. Rivers froze. Crops did not grow. Famine became widespread. For English peasants living in the countryside, this was a disaster. Animals died of cold. Grain stocks were depleted. People sometimes had to settle for just a handful of bran bread and water. In the Middle Ages, 90% of England's population lived in the countryside. These people were peasants, working for land-owning lords. Their daily lives consisted of working in the fields, tending to animals, and meeting the basic needs of their families. A small elite class of nobles and clergy lived a completely different life from the rest of society. This class difference was especially evident in winter. While a noble family sat in front of large fireplaces inside a stone castle, a peasant struggled to sleep while shivering in a hut. Climate and shelter. To understand the severity of winter, we must look closer at the climate conditions of the period. From the late 13th century, temperatures across Europe began to drop. Scientists estimate that average temperatures fell by 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. 1 or 2 degrees might not seem like much, but this small change had a massive impact on agriculture and daily life. The growing season shortened, and rainfall increased. The soil became unproductive. Crops rotted. Between 1315 and 1322, a period known as the Great Famine occurred. Excessive rain and cold weather led to crop failure. People died of hunger, diseases spread, and villages were emptied. This famine was a harbinger of the harsh winters to come in the following centuries in England. Winters were particularly severe in the 1380s and 1400s. The River Thames froze completely several times. People walked on the river, and frost fairs were even organized on the ice. These extraordinary events show just how intense the cold was. But how did people live in such a cold climate? In the Middle Ages, housing structures varied greatly according to social class. However, almost everyone had one thing in common: houses were extremely primitive, cold, and damp by today's standards. Yet, these primitive structures were enough to survive. Let's examine these structures more closely. First, let's look at village houses. A peasant usually lived in a small 1 or 2 room hut made of local materials. The walls were generally built with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung over a wooden frame. This was called wattle and daub. For the roof, wooden branches were woven and covered with straw or reeds. The roof was sloped so rainwater could flow easily, but these roofs were not waterproof. Leaks occurred during rain. When it snowed in winter, those living under the roof struggled with moisture and cold. Because the walls were thin, the wind entered easily. Glass was extremely expensive and a luxury for peasants. Therefore, windows were usually closed with wooden shutters. But keeping the shutters closed left the inside dark. Opening them for light meant cold air. Thus, in winter, peasant houses were either dark and stuffy or bright but freezing cold. The flooring was usually earth, sometimes covered with straw. This straw provided both insulation and a bit of softness. However, straw became damp, smelled bad, and led to the breeding of various vermin. It needed to be changed regularly, but poor families couldn't do this often. Consequently, the ground was usually dirty, damp, and cold. In winter, the floor became ice cold, freezing the feet of those walking barefoot. A peasant's hut usually consisted of a single room. This room was the living room, dining room, and bedroom all in one. All family members lived in this single space. Mother, father, children, sometimes grandparents, and even animals shared the same area. Yes, animals. On particularly cold winter nights, valuable animals were taken inside. Cows, sheep, goats, or pigs lived under the same roof as humans. There were several reasons for this. First, the body heat of the animals helped warm the house. Second, leaving animals outside increased the risk of them dying from the cold. Losing an animal would be an economic disaster for the family. The only heat source in the house was an open fire lit in the middle of the room. The fire was built directly on the floor, in the very center of the house. Usually, a large iron cauldron was hung over it. This cauldron was used for cooking, boiling water, and sometimes washing clothes. The fire was also the only light source in the house. Candles or oil lamps were extremely expensive at night. Therefore, families gathered around the fire, trying to benefit from both its light and heat. However, the open fire had serious disadvantages. First, there was no proper chimney for the smoke. The smoke would try to escape through a small hole in the roof, but most of the time, it circulated inside the house. This made breathing difficult. People constantly coughed, and their eyes watered. Chronic respiratory diseases were common. If the hole in the roof was too large, rain and snow would enter. If it was too small, the smoke wouldn't escape. It was hard to strike a balance. Secondly, keeping the fire alive required great effort. Gathering wood in winter was hard work. Peasants usually had to get permission to collect wood from the lord's forests, and these permissions were limited. If the wood was damp, it produced a lot of smoke while burning. Finding dry wood was difficult. Therefore, the fire sometimes went out. Once it did, it took hours to reheat the house. Someone had to stay awake and regularly add wood to keep the fire alive through the night. But families were usually very tired. The fire would go out at midnight, and the house would be freezing by morning. Now, let's look at the residences of the nobility. Their conditions were very different. In the Middle Ages, a noble family usually lived in a castle or a large manor house built of stone. Thick stone walls blocked the wind and cold better. But stone was also a very cold material. In winter, stone walls became ice cold. Touching them could freeze your fingers. This is why nobles began covering their walls with tapestries. These rugs were not just decorative, they provided insulation, preventing the walls from cooling down to some extent. Among the nobility, heating was provided by fireplaces, fire boxes built into the wall with proper chimneys. The smoke went directly out of the chimney. This was much more effective and healthier than the open fires in peasant huts. There would be massive fireplaces in great halls where huge logs were burned. The fire could burn for days. But while those closest to the fireplace stayed warm, the distant corners of the room remained cold. Large stone halls never truly warmed up. Therefore, people sat pressed against the fireplace. The nobility had multiple rooms. Bedrooms were separate. There were dining rooms, reception halls, chapels, and storage rooms. Transitions between these rooms were through cold corridors, which were generally not heated. For this reason, thick fur coats were worn when moving from one room to another during winter months. Some wealthy families brought small portable heaters to their bedrooms. These were metal containers filled with embers. But these were also dangerous. If used incorrectly, they could start a fire. Let's talk about glass. Glass windows became more common toward the end of the Middle Ages, but they were still extremely expensive. Only very wealthy nobles, churches, and monasteries could afford glass windows. Glass provided the advantage of letting light in while blocking the wind. But the windows were not double-glazed. A single layer of glass improved insulation but was not enough. In winter months, ice would form even on the inside of the windows. Breath would turn into steam. Monasteries and churches held a special place in the Middle Ages. Monks and nuns led a disciplined life filled with regular prayers. But praying for hours in cold stone churches during winter was extremely difficult. Monasteries were generally large stone structures and were almost impossible to heat. Church halls would be freezing during prayers. Monks wore thick wool robes, but even this wasn't enough. Their fingers froze, and their feet went numb. Some monasteries had a special room called a kale factory, heating room. This was the only heated place in the monastery. Monks could take turns entering here to warm up. But the time spent in this room was limited because monastic life advocated a simple life, not the pursuit of comfort. Enduring the cold was seen as a form of spiritual discipline. Some monks increased their resistance to the cold by washing with cold water or walking barefoot on cold stone floors. These practices were seen as a way to restrain the desires of the body. Sleep patterns and beds. We understand the structure of the houses, but how did people sleep in them? What were their sleep patterns? What were the beds like? Let's try to answer these questions. Sleep was one of the most basic needs of daily life, but sleep in the Middle Ages was not an uninterrupted 8-hour rest like today. People slept differently. In the Middle Ages, especially on winter nights, people went to bed very early. Shortly after the sun went down, families would get into bed. This was due to both exhaustion and the lack of light. Candles were expensive, and oil lamps consumed oil. Therefore, once darkness fell, there wasn't much left to do. Keeping the fire alive was also difficult. Getting into bed was the best way to both stay warm and save energy. Families usually went to bed at sunset, around 5 to 6 p.m. Since winter days were very short, they could stay in bed for up to 14 hours. Historians have discovered that medieval people had a two-stage sleep pattern. They would go to bed in the evening and sleep for a few hours. This was the first sleep period. Then they would wake up around midnight. This wakefulness lasted an hour or two. During this time, people did various things. Some prayed, some talked quietly with their spouses, some added wood to the fire, and some did simple chores. Then they would sleep again. This second sleep lasted until morning. This pattern was completely natural. Everyone woke up with the sunrise. Scientists believe this sleep pattern was suited to the human body's natural rhythm. Before the invention of electric lighting, darkness lasted a very long time, and the body naturally adapted to it. Two-stage sleep allowed for more flexibility throughout the night. For example, if the fire went out, one could wake up in the middle of the night to relight it, or if there was danger outside, it could be checked several times. Where did people sleep? What were the beds like? Peasants' beds were extremely simple. Usually, a wool or linen bag was placed over a pile of straw spread on the ground. This bag was called a straw mattress. The straw provided some softness, but over time, it would flatten and lose its comfort. Insects lived inside the straw. Fleas, ticks, and mice were common. These animals would crawl onto the bodies of sleeping people. Itching and discomfort were constant problems. The items used to cover the beds were usually woolen blankets or linen sheets. Families who were not wealthy had very few blankets, perhaps just one thick woolen blanket. This blanket had to cover all family members. When wool became damp, it became heavy and smelly, but it was still the best insulation material. Sheep's wool retained body heat, making woolen clothes and blankets vital. Linen was lighter but provided less warmth and was generally used in summer. Families usually slept together in one large bed. Everyone lay side by side. Mother, father, children, and sometimes the elderly were all in the same bed. There were several practical reasons for this. First, sharing body heat helped with warming up. When people huddled together, a shared body temperature was created. This was especially important for children, who struggled to regulate their body heat. They felt safer and warmer next to their parents. The second reason was economic. Making more than one bed required materials and money, which peasants did not have. Furthermore, there was no room for multiple beds in a one-room hut. Therefore, everyone shared the same bed. The third reason was security. If there was a problem in the family at night, everyone would be together. If one of the children got sick, the parents would notice immediately. If there was danger outside, everyone would wake up together. However, this arrangement meant a lack of privacy. Intimate moments for couples were experienced quietly while the children slept. The elderly snored. Children were active throughout the night. If someone got up, they would wake the others. But this situation had become normalized. Back then, the concept of privacy was not like today. People were used to communal living. The beds of the nobility were much more luxurious. Noble families had wooden-framed, high-legged beds. Space was left under these beds to protect from both the cold on the ground and vermin. Thick mattresses were placed on the bed, filled with wool, feathers, or even silk. Feather mattresses were incredibly soft but very expensive. Only the wealthiest families could afford them. Curtains were hung around the bed. These were called bed curtains. The curtains were made of heavy fabric, usually dark wool or velvet. These curtains isolated the bed from the outside world. They blocked drafts, light, and provided privacy. Even nobles sometimes shared their rooms with servants. While the servants slept in a corner of the room, the noble family slept behind the curtains. When the curtains were closed, the bed became almost like a small room, dark, warm, and quiet. A large number of blankets and quilts were placed on these beds. Fur-lined quilts were also used. Some wealthy families used quilts lined with squirrel, sable, or fox fur. These furs were extremely warm but heavy and expensive. Some bed covers were so heavy that it was difficult to move under them, but this weight increased the warmth. Body heat was trapped under the blankets, keeping the person warm. Pillows were also used, filled with feathers, wool, or linen. Soft pillows provided neck support. However, most peasants did not use pillows. Only a folded piece of cloth was placed under their heads. Sometimes nothing was used at all. The head was placed directly on the straw. It wasn't comfortable, but it was common. Regarding clothing, people did not take off their daily clothes. Mostly, they slept in their clothes to stay warm throughout the night. Clothes provided an extra layer of insulation. Also, there was no need to get dressed immediately upon waking up. They just put on their outer garments and started work. Some wore special long shirts for the night called nightgowns, made of linen or wool. They were long and loose, reaching down to the ankles. They were both comfortable and warm. Feet were usually left bare. But on very cold nights, woolen socks were worn. Some wrapped their feet in cloth. Keeping the feet warm was important because once the feet froze, the whole body cooled down. Cold feet lowered sleep quality. Some wealthy people placed hot bricks or stones at the foot of their beds. This brick was heated over the fire during the day, wrapped in a thick cloth, and placed in the bed. It would provide warmth for hours. This was a simple but effective method, maintaining body heat. Now let's get to an important question. What were the methods for preserving body heat? Which strategies were used to protect against the cold? They weren't limited to just blankets and clothes. They developed various creative solutions. First of all, dressing in layers was very important. People wore multi-layered clothing. A thin linen shirt at the bottom, a wool tunic over it, then a thick cloak or jacket added on top. Each layer created air pockets, increasing insulation. Wool was the most valuable material. Wool obtained from sheep was a natural insulating material that stayed warm even when damp. Linen provided less warmth but was more comfortable against the skin, so it was worn on the inside while wool was worn on the outside. The wealthy added fur to their clothes. Fur was the warmest material, but only nobles and merchants could wear it. Fur was unattainable for peasants. Wearing a head covering was also important. Most body heat is lost through the head. Therefore, people used hoods, bonnets, or shawls made of wool or linen. They covered their heads even while sleeping at night. Some slept with a woolen bonnet. It might seem strange, but it was an effective method. Protecting hands was difficult. Gloves were used, but it was hard to work with thick gloves. Therefore, people occasionally warmed their hands by the fire while working. At night, hands were tucked under the blankets. Drinking hot beverages was another way to increase body temperature. In the evenings, hot soup was consumed. Warm foods like oatmeal, vegetable soup, or broth warmed from the inside. Herbal teas prepared with hot water were also consumed. Herbs like sage, mint, or chamomile were boiled and drunk hot. These drinks both warmed and soothed. Alcohol was also used. Beer and wine were particularly common in the Middle Ages. Alcohol creates a temporary feeling of warmth in the body, but in the long run, it actually lowers body temperature. Nevertheless, people would drink a glass of wine or beer in the evenings. Moving was the most natural way to increase body temperature. People worked constantly throughout the day. Physical activities like working in the fields, cutting wood, and tending to animals warmed the body. Consuming fatty foods was also important. Fat produces energy in the body. In winter, more fatty foods were consumed. Tallow, butter, cheese, or fatty meats increased the body's resistance to the cold. But for poor peasants, these were luxuries. Most of the time, they had to settle for bran bread, water, and perhaps a little cheese. Dangers of the night. Now let's look at the dangers faced at night and the precautions taken against them. Medieval winter nights were filled with many dangers, not just the cold. The first danger was fire. The open fire was in the very middle of the house. Dry straw, wooden roofs, and greasy clothes were extremely flammable. A spark could destroy the entire hut within minutes. The risk was especially high while sleeping at night if the fire went out of control. Therefore, a stone or clay wall was built around the fire, and a metal grate was placed over it. Before going to bed, they made sure the fire was safe. Still, accidents happened. According to historical records, many villages were destroyed in fires. A fire starting in one house quickly spread to neighboring houses because they were so close to each other. Firefighting capabilities were limited. Water was carried in buckets, but most of the time it wasn't enough. When a fire broke out, the best solution was to flee. People took whatever they could grab and ran. The second danger was disease. In the winter months, cold and dampness made it easier for diseases to spread. Respiratory infections were very common. Coughs, colds, and flu spread rapidly. If one family member got sick, the others would too, because everyone was in the same room and the same bed. Hygiene conditions were inadequate. People didn't wash often, and clothes remained dirty. Bacteria and viruses multiplied easily in this environment. Serious illnesses like pneumonia could be fatal. The elderly, infants, and those with weak immune systems were particularly at risk. Medical knowledge and treatment options were extremely limited. Generally, treatment was attempted with homemade herbal teas and prayers, but these were often ineffective. Many people died even from simple infections. The third danger was theft and attacks. In the Middle Ages, as hunger and poverty increased during winter, theft became more common. Desperate people could enter neighbors' houses to steal food and wood. In some cases, bandits organized raids on villages. Therefore, doors were locked tightly at night. Doors were closed with wooden bolts or heavy planks. Some families placed heavy chests behind the door. There were watchmen in the villages who patrolled at night to ensure everything was in order. If they noticed anything suspicious, they warned the village. Some wealthy villages had walls and gates. At night, the gates were closed to provide protection against external threats. The fourth danger was wild animals. In the rural areas of medieval England, wild animals still lived. Wolves were one of the greatest threats. Hungry wolves could approach villages in winter. They hunted livestock, and in some cases, they could even attack humans. Therefore, animals were locked in barns at night, and barn doors were tightly bolted. Some families slept next to the barn to protect their animals. Small predators like foxes and martens also posed a threat. They could kill chickens. Losing a chicken was a big loss for a family because it was a source of eggs. Therefore, chickens were placed in secure cages. If a sound was heard at night, the family would wake up and check the fifth danger was freezing to death. On some very cold nights, the fire would go out completely. Reheating the house became impossible. In these cases, people could freeze to death. The elderly and infants were particularly at risk. The elderly struggled to regulate their body temperature, and infants were very small and vulnerable. If not kept warm enough, hypothermia could develop. Families did everything they could to reduce these risks. Parents stayed awake during the night to check on their children. If one of the children seemed very cold, they tried to warm them with their own body heat. They would take the baby to their chest and wrap them under a blanket. This prevented the baby from freezing. Still, every winter, some families lost their children. These tragic losses were a painful reality of that period. Religion and culture. Now let's look at the religious and cultural dimension. In the Middle Ages, religion played a central role in every aspect of life. Sleep and the night were also affected by this. According to Christian belief, the night was dark and dangerous. The devil and evil spirits roamed at night. Therefore, people prayed before going to bed to ask for protection. Simple prayers like, "Lord, protect us tonight," were said. Some families hung a cross at the head of the bed, believing it would drive away evil spirits. Monks and nuns said regular prayers throughout the night. There were night services in monasteries. Monks woke up at midnight and went to the church to pray. These prayers were called night prayers or matins in Latin. These prayers were intended to ensure God's protection and purify the soul. For monks, sleep was interrupted and restricted, but this was part of spiritual discipline. In some traditions, dreams seen during sleep were important. Dreams were seen as messages from God. Someone who had a very vivid dream would tell a priest about it. The priest would interpret the dream and explain its meaning. Some dreams were accepted as prophecies of the future. Therefore, people gave great importance to their dreams. There were also some folk beliefs. For example, it was important to close the windows before going to bed because it was believed that evil spirits could enter through an open window. Or putting salt under the bed would drive away evil spirits. While these practices had no scientific basis, they provided psychological comfort to people. In the winter months, especially around Christmas, there were special traditions. On Christmas Eve, families prepared special meals. If possible, they ate meat, drank wine, and sang songs. This brought some joy and hope in the middle of the long, dark winter. On Christmas Eve, the fire was kept alive all night because this night was considered holy. People believed God protected them on this night. The winter solstice was also important. It was the longest night. After that, the days would slowly start to lengthen, giving people hope. It reminded them that spring was approaching. In some villages, solstice celebrations were held. Large fires were lit, and there were dances and songs. These celebrations were for both entertainment and spiritual renewal, special circumstances and evolution. Now let's look at some special situations. Winter nights were harder for pregnant women. During pregnancy, the body consumes more energy and needs more heat. But mobility decreased. It was hard to sleep deeply during long winter nights. A pregnant woman had to lie on her side, but the hard straw mattress made this difficult. Also, there was a need to get up frequently at night for the toilet. But going outside meant freezing cold. Therefore, some families used simple ceramic or wooden chamber pots inside. It was harder for women giving birth. Births usually happened at home, with experienced women called midwives assisting. But giving birth in winter was very risky for both mother and baby. A cold room increased the risk of infection. The baby had to be kept warm as soon as it was born. The midwife would wrap the baby in woolen cloths and place it next to the mother, who would warm the baby with her body heat. The first days were critical. If not kept warm enough, the baby could die. Unfortunately, infant mortality rates were very high. Many babies died in the first days or weeks. Winter nights were also hard for the elderly. Their bones were weak, and they struggled to regulate their body temperature. They also had ailments like rheumatism and joint pain, which were worsened by cold weather. Since the elderly had difficulty moving, they remained in a fixed position at night, leading to muscle stiffness and more pain. Families took extra care of their elderly members, sleeping them closer to the fire and covering them with extra blankets. They checked their condition throughout the night. Special precautions were also taken for those who were sick. If a family member got sick, they were kept as warm as possible. Hot drinks were given, and herbal teas were served. Their body was wrapped in woolen blankets, and sometimes stones heated by the fire were placed next to them. But these methods were often insufficient. If the illness was severe, the patient died. Even organizing a funeral in winter was difficult. The ground froze, making it almost impossible to dig a grave. Therefore, some bodies were kept until spring. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, some technological progress occurred. In the 15th century, brick chimneys became common, especially in cities. These chimneys removed smoke more effectively. Fireplace designs were improved, and more efficient heating models were developed. But these innovations primarily reached wealthy city dwellers. Rural peasants continued to live with old methods. Glass windows slowly became widespread. But they were still expensive. Until the end of the 15th century, even middle-class merchants could afford glass windows. This meant more light inside houses and less cold entering. Bed designs also improved. More comfortable mattresses and high-quality fabrics began to be used. But these developments did not affect the majority of society. Until the 16th century, living conditions in much of rural Europe remained primitive. Legacy and reflection. Looking at the Middle Ages from today, it is impressive how much has changed. Today we have modern heating systems, electric blankets, insulated houses, and comfortable beds. In developed countries, freezing to death in winter is now rare. But we must not forget how recent these developments are. For most of human history, people lived in difficult conditions like medieval peasants. Fighting the cold was a natural part of life. Medieval experiences show the resilience and creativity of humans. They survived with limited resources and simple tools. Families supported each other, and communities worked together. They overcame harsh winter nights together. This spirit of solidarity is perhaps the most valuable legacy of that period. Furthermore, medieval sleep patterns inspire modern sleep research. Two-phase sleep might be more suited to the human body's natural rhythm. Today, some researchers say that uninterrupted 8-hour sleep is a modern invention. In the pre-electric era, people slept more flexibly. This arrangement allowed for more flexibility throughout the night. Perhaps modern insomnia problems are related to our loss of this natural rhythm. We told the story of how people slept during the coldest winters in medieval England. This is not just history, it is also a story of human endurance. People struggled with freezing cold, disease, and hunger. Yet, they survived. Families stayed together. Communities bonded. They developed simple but effective methods. They shared body heat. They lived with animals. They kept the fire alive. They divided the night with two-phase sleep. They soothed their souls with prayers. Class differences were huge. While nobles slept in comfortable bedrooms, peasants shivered in cold huts. But both classes faced the hardships of winter. At that time, no amount of wealth could provide modern comfort. Everyone bowed to the power of nature. This story teaches us many things. First, the power of human adaptation. Even in the most difficult conditions, people continued to live. Second, the importance of community and family. It was almost impossible to survive alone. Being together was the key to survival. Third, the value of technological progress. The comforts we have today are the result of centuries of slow development. We must value this. Medieval winter nights could be dark, cold, and harsh, but they were also the times when people needed each other most. Families gathered together. Stories were told. Prayers were said. Perhaps these difficult nights made societies stronger. People learned to need each other. They learned to trust. Now we have come to the end of this long journey. Perhaps your eyes are starting to close. Perhaps you have already fallen into a deep sleep. In either case, remember that you are in a much warmer and safer place than the cold nights of the Middle Ages. You are enjoying the comforts of the modern world in your comfortable bed, under warm blankets, but perhaps now you will appreciate this comfort more. You might think of the resilience of your ancestors and feel grateful to them. Because their struggle made it possible for us to live comfortably today. Good night. May your sleep be peaceful. A new day will start tomorrow. But tonight, be thankful that you are warm and safe. Be happy that you don't have to sleep in the cold nights of the Middle Ages. Sweet dreams. Let your eyes slowly close. Let your breath become steady. Let your body relax. Let sleep come to you. And when you wake up in the morning, perhaps you will remember this long story. Perhaps you will smile and enjoy the day. Good night, dear listener. Sleep in peace.